keep it real.
Check it, the name be Ali G representing the United Kingdom. Now, we is got a very important topic today. We is talking about the Cold War. This turf war spanned from the 1940s to 1991. It was between the east side of the Soviet Union and the communist bloc of the Warsaw Pact against the west side forces of the United States in America and the allied forces of the NATO Pact. This be a war about nukes. Those in charge of the bombs were the Cold Warriors, more specifically Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher. They be them rough and tumble types, earning their nickname on account of their cold-blooded ruthlessness. Check it, now we is on to the juicy stuff. Booyaka shot. In his first term as US President, Ronald Reagan was faced with a foreign policy still greatly dictated by continuing tensions of the Cold War. Referring to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, Reagan's approach was to increase US military capabilities, both in terms of troops and weaponry, as a forceful deterrent. Going beyond that, in 1983, Reagan introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars, an anti-ballistic missile system which would be designed to defend the US from Russian nuclear missiles. The president also enacted the Reagan Doctrine to offer financial support to freedom fighters struggling against communism around the world. All this exerted pressure on the Soviet Union to bring an end to the Cold War. In 1982, Reagan ordered the invasion of the island Grenada in the Caribbean, where US forces rescued a group of medical students following the overthrow of the government by Marxist rebels. Reagan was able to make progress in his second term because he and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev developed a lasting mutual respectful compatibility in their diplomatic views. In 1987, these two world leaders agreed to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear missiles, a historic move forward in disarmament. While visiting Germany later that year, President Reagan spoke out at the Berlin Wall, addressing Gorbachev directly with the famous commandment,
"Tear down this wall."
Check it. As Secretary General of the Communist Party for the USSR beginning in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the first Soviet leader in decades to indicate an interest in forging better relations with the West and reforms at home, reaching out with his program of Glasnost, which meaning openness. Intent on improving economic conditions in Russia, he believed this would entail fostering better exchange with the US and Europe if success were to be achieved. With this in mind, Gorbachev developed an excellent rapport with both British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan, and relations between the powers began to thaw. Gorbachev initiated change in looking to improve the Soviet state itself with perestroika, meaning restructuring, focused on reorganization and productivity. By 1990, Gorbachev was elected to the newly established presidency of the USSR. Although under economic strain domestically, he continued more liberal policies that contributed to the easing of international tensions and progress in nuclear radiation talks. He also responded benignly to Eastern European satellites as they sought the dissolution of their ties to Moscow in 1989. When agitation for the fall of the Berlin Wall reached its peak, he did not allow Moscow to respond, and the wall came down as German reunification closed. Check it. We be talking about the Cold War. Why is the fighting going on for so many years? When wouldn't it be just smarter for the nations to ambush during the summer when the wars stop due to the heat? Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of Great Britain in May 1979. Over the course of her 11 years in office, she played a pivotal role in global politics, affecting the push to end the Cold War. Thatcher's decision to leave America cruise missiles to be stationed on British bases opened the same course of action for West Germany. This pressured the Soviets into negotiations, which eventually resulted in the Immediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987. Thatcher's solid relationship with US President Ronald Reagan and a compatible view that the supremacy of communism in the USSR must be challenged made her a vital component in its downfall.
Check it. These ain't the only ones who exerted influence. There's also people like Pope John Paul II and Václav Havel.
With his election to the papacy in 1978, John Paul II made history by becoming the first non-Italian pope in more than 400 years. Growing up in Poland personally attuned him to the desperation and oppression of his native country. His high ecumenical position and prominent international profile gave him the ability to advance the cause of freedom. John Paul's 1979 return to his homeland provided inspiration and strength of purpose to the Polish people. It also prompted the creation of Solidarity, which initiated a growing momentum toward the dissolution of communist governments throughout the Eastern Bloc.
If this be a Cold War, did them soldiers get summer vacations?
Václav Havel's strong views, standing contrary to those of the state, cost Czechoslovakian playwright and political dissenter years in communist prisons and life under constant scrutiny by the secret police. Much of his writing was also suppressed by the communist government. As much of Eastern Europe began to refuse continuing Soviet rule and sought self-determination, Havel became the main negotiator with the standing communist government in an attempt to peacefully transition to a democratic state. In 1989, after 4 decades of oppressive communist rule, Havel successfully achieved this in what is referred to as the Velvet Revolution. This revolt was so named for its relatively mild demonstrations, which brought the collapse of the Communist Party. This transition proceeded so smoothly that it lasted only weeks and not one shot was ever fired. The country converted to a capitalistic system and in the following year held its first democratic elections. Václav Havel became president of the newly named Czech Republic.
Check it. This be Ali G checking in once again, reminding you that history is a mystery. Just remember, check yourself before you wreck yourself.